There were so many action figure vehicles of the 80s and 90s, but out of the hundreds of different vehicles, which are the ones that actually stood out? I'm talking about action figure vehicles that transcended popularity just amongst toy collectors and into common pop culture. So on this list, we're going to look at some of the top 10 action figure vehicles of the 80s and 90s. Welcome back, guys. It's Thomas, and today's list is strictly focused on action figure vehicles. And more specifically, what are action figure vehicles for the millennial generation? Depending on what information you look up, there's different timelines of when a millennial came of age, but I'm really going to focus on the early 80s to mid to late 90s. And for me, I think it's really that era for the millennials. I think we were one of probably the last group of big collectors, but we got the best of both worlds. We got to see what our older cousins or older brothers had earlier, and some of those were hand-me-downs, but then also we got some really cool stuff of our own in the 90s. So we're going to talk about all that. Now, for the most part on this list, the action figure vehicle that made the list really had to be a named vehicle. It had to be something that when you think of that toy line, the first vehicle that comes to your mind. So it was a little tricky in some areas, and we'll kind of go over that when we get to those toy lines. These are the ones that are ingrained in pop culture well beyond toy collectors. First, let's talk about Mattel's Masters of the Universe. Now, when we think of vehicles that the action figures rode from Masters of the Universe, I know there were a ton, but counting this as a vehicle might be a little controversial, but it is something a character rode, and in some cases it could be its own character. So Battle Cat, I think, is one of the most iconic of vehicles, even though it's a character. Putting that on this list is because when you think of He-Man or Masters of the Universe, what is he riding into battle on? Yes, there's tons of other vehicles, but for the most part, he's always going to be riding on Battle Cat. And released in 1982, this was a cheap repaint of a 1970s toy line, Big Jim, and there was a tiger in that toy line. They just said paint it green, give it yellow stripes, and boom, there's Battle Cat. And to most eagle-eyed Master of the Universe fans, you probably saw a little nod to Big Jim in the new Master of the Universe trailer, so I thought that was pretty neat. And I was probably a little too young for Masters of the Universe or this next one, which is Thundercats. However, we had older cousins that were either the youngest of young Gen Xers or probably on the older side of millennials, so we got our share of Master of the Universe and got to see Thundercats and sometimes play with them. Thundercats were released by LJN in 1985. They made their figures a little bigger and bulkier. I think most famous, other than Thundercats, they made those big rubber wrestling figures, but their iconic action figure vehicle is the Thunder Tank. Always thought this thing was super awesome. It was a sea vehicle, it was a land vehicle, it can climb up mountains, it had a retractable jaw, the arms moved. This thing was awesome. The one downside is that the original one only fit 2 characters. Super 7 went on to later remake this, and that thing is a monster of a vehicle, but still pretty iconic in terms of action figure vehicles of all time. Believe it or not, this next one almost didn't make the list because I don't think there is one particular vehicle where you can name that action figure toy line or character and it is synonymous with one vehicle, and that is G.I. Joe's Real American Hero. Now, I could be wrong, but I think the problem is that they just had too many awesome vehicles that there was just not one that defined the toy line. I did end up picking 1 or 2 to kind of just throw it out there, but this is really a question for you guys. Which G.I. Joe Real American Hero vehicle do you think is the quintessential vehicle? On this list, I picked 2, and one is the Sky Striker and the other is the Whale. So Hasbro released the Sky Striker in 1983, and this one of all the aerial vehicles I think is probably the most iconic. It's the one that looks most realistic, and it just had a lot of cool features. So I'm gonna put it on there, but for me personally, if I had to pick, 1984's The Whale is probably one of my favorites. This one is land and sea. I don't think there were hovercrafts made at the time, which was probably awesome. And then it came with one of my favorite characters, which is Cutter. Later on, I got a different version of Cutter, but I always thought the Whale was super awesome. Let me know what you think. Which is the most iconic G.I. Joe vehicle? Fast forwarding to 1995, Toy Biz X-Men line was awesome, and they gave us the vehicle that defines the X-Men, and that is the Blackbird. This is a vehicle I always wish we had. I think this one was super awesome. You can fit so many figures in. The pieces came apart, so it was a little modular. It had a command center, and it was big, but it was still small enough where you can pick it up and fly it around. And I don't think there is another vehicle that might be as iconic in terms of Marvel. So in all of Marvel, like, this is the vehicle I think of, maybe second to Ghost Rider's motorcycle, but I'm gonna put the Blackbird even above that. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers came out from Bandai in 1993, and this is probably the most unique on the list because your figures can't go in these action figure vehicles. You kind of had to use your imagination that there was just the characters inside the vehicle, which would be the Zords, and combining them all together was the Megazord. I never had this as a kid, but I remember a friend did. It came in a giant box, and it came with all 5 Zords that you could play with individually, or you could put them all together and make the Megazord. But not only that, if you had the Zords where you can put them all together and make the Megazord, you can also combine future releases to make the Ultra Megazord with Titanus and the Dragon Zord. One downside about this vehicle is that we never got extra large figures of the villains, or at least not that I know of that were meant to be in that scale. So you really didn't have anything for the Megazord to fight. It just looked badass on a shelf. With the release of Jurassic Park, we got some awesome action figures, play sets, and of course vehicles from Kenner in 1993. Now, this vehicle had a major part in the film. The kids get stuck in it. They're getting chased around. It starts off as the tour vehicle until it gets destroyed by the T-Rex, but I'm talking about the Jungle Explorer. It was never actually named that in the film, as far as I know, but of course the action figure packaging is going to have at least a name for what that vehicle is. But when you think about not just the phenomenon that was Jurassic Park, but that point in the 90s where everything's bright and colored, red, neon yellow, neon green, all kind of mixed together with kind of those dinosaur tears on it, this vehicle, even if you don't know what it's called, is still extremely iconic. Ghostbusters came onto the scene in 1984, and Kenner released a whole bunch of different figures and vehicles, but the one I'm talking about, of course, is the Ecto-1. And the Ecto-1 we got was actually released on a real Ghostbusters from the cartoon, not from the movie. Years later, that would be released, the newest one in the Hasbro HasLab, which looks fantastic. But I think most people, even if you're not a toy collector, you probably know of the Ecto-1. You probably have seen the film, or at least some of them, where you recognize that vehicle. And this is one that I think transcends toy collectors, even just fans of movies or comedy. They know the Ecto-1, but us toy collectors, we know it. It was probably in at least our fleet of vehicles back in the late 80s, early 90s. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles just seems to make every list because they were making some awesome stuff. The TMNT Party Wagon, I think, is one of the most iconic action figure vehicles in all of toys. Every subsequent version of the Turtles has gotten their own different version of the Party Wagon, and it's just kind of continued this trend that the Turtles must have this vehicle. But of course, I'm talking about the original, released in 1989. This was a favorite of ours growing up, and it had so many cool play features. The lid popped off, so you could put all your turtles inside, 2 in the driver's seat, and then it had the cabin that opened up with the missile and the rockets that flew out. So always had a great time with this. They released this one a bunch of times, and I think even most recently Playmates released it a couple years ago. I have my NECA version, which I absolutely love, but couldn't have this list without having the TMNT Party Wagon on it. In my top 10 iconic playsets, I put the Kenner Batcave on there just because it was released so many times and so many kids had a chance of actually playing with that particular playset. And it was the same exact playset over and over again. I couldn't really do that with the Batmobile, but of course, the Batmobile needs to be on the list. If you were an older Gen Xer or a very young millennial, you had so many different options of Batmobiles. There was the Superpowers version, then there was the Toy Biz version, which is the one we had, but there was always something kind of missing about it. didn't have the canopy. I know it was released again with like a plastic shell that you can put on for the armor. It wasn't until Kenner took over the line where they started making it look a little more screen accurate, the standard version, but then there was one called the Bat Missile, which you could recreate the scene from Batman Returns. The sides came apart. We had the Batman the Animated Series version of the Batmobile, Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, and then the New Adventures of Batman and Robin. And my bias would lead me towards picking the ones from the Tim Burton Batman movies, from Batman 1 and Batman Returns, but I'm gonna go with the Batman the Animated Series as one of the most iconic Batmobiles. It was different. I think it stayed relevant for quite some time before they changed it. And you gotta think the animated show was still going strong while the movies were changing things with the look of the Batmobile. In terms of longevity, Batman the Animated Series Batmobile is the most iconic Batmobile. When Star Wars came back onto the scene in the mid to late 90s, I remember they did this whole thing releasing the trilogy back in theaters. They released the trilogy on videotape, all in preparation for 1999's release of Episode 1, but we had to get the Millennium Falcon. And by we, I don't mean myself. Unfortunately, I never had one, but I think in terms of pop culture, in terms of toy collectors, the Millennium Falcon is iconic in so many different ways, and the toy was just as amazing. So in 1995, Kenner did re-release the Millennium Falcon. It wasn't a complete remold or rehash of the original one. It had different sounds, it had more compartments to put your figures in, a little more realistic deco, and when you think of Star Wars and you think of that vehicle, I have to put the Millennium Falcon at the top of the list. Hope you enjoyed this list. If you did, please do me a favor, hit like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And until the next episode, we'll catch you next time.